Hi, my name is Saunders, and I'm here to discuss performance metrics with you. Specifically, a case study that was done by some Microsoft employees as a comparison between the Microsoft Kinect and the gold standard of the industry, the Qualisys motion capture system, in terms of the acquisition of kinematic data. To begin, I'd like to do a little bit of a background. First, what are performance metrics? Well, performance metrics are a quantifiable means to develop, iterate, and improve on a product. This, however, is not a specific definition and instead is something that can be viewed as more of a general idea. The performance metrics themselves are actually something that isn't quite specific to one person or one industry or one product. They're not widely identified as having any sort of baseline outside of general terms like effectiveness, error rates, user satisfaction, and others. This does mean that the same product could have different performance metrics based on the industry that it is in use with. Um, Also, individual preference can have a huge impact on not just the metrics themselves, but the importance of the metrics. One individual may prefer how a golf club handle grips better than another, and that means that that person prefers that grip, while the other person could prefer how it swings and doesn't really care as much about the grip themselves. This is something that does have dramatic impacts based on the data that is being tested and acquired for the product. For this particular case study, the authors were investigating the Microsoft Kinect, which was a product that was initially developed as an optional alternative video game control scheme. This was something that is motion controlled uh, and voice activated and offered a different way to interact with video games than the traditional controller with buttons and joysticks and similar features. And the authors were investigating to see if the actual motion capture software would have biomechanical research application outside of interactions with video games. Specifically, they were looking at how it impacts kinematics, which are the capture analysis of three-dimensional movement data. Kinematics help bolster and facilitate studies of joint pathology, ergonomics, athletic performance, and different trauma studies, as well as other applications. Again, they were comparing the data acquired from the second generation of the Microsoft Kinect versus the gold standard in the industry, which is a Qualisys motion capture system. This, however, was a pilot study, and it was mostly to see whether or not the Kinect could possibly serve as a more cost-effective alternative to the Qualisys system. Pictured here are the Microsoft Kinect 2.0 sensor as well as the Qualisys motion capture camera. Important to note, however, that the Microsoft Kinect is almost entirely in that one camera. It comes with a software package as well, while this Qualisys camera is one of multiple that would be used, as well as likely with a motion capture suit to help facilitate data acquisition. This does mean that the Kinect itself is inherently a less expensive option, but as we'll soon find out, this also can mean that the Kinect may not have the accuracy or precision that the Qualisys does offer. So, for the purposes of this study, there wasn't needed a large sample size of population, as the data being acquired could be repeated by just a relatively small number of individuals. The population being investigated instead was a range of different motions undertaken by those individuals. There were 4 subjects that were motion captured by 2 of the Kinects and 2 of the Qualisys systems simultaneously. This had a Kinect and a Qualisys were positioned at the same point in 2 different areas to reduce any statistical noise that could be present from different angles. The 2 primary aspects of motion that were being monitored were joint center displacement, which is how off from center a specific joint can be in a motion, the distance here, while a joint angle was the other range of motion, which would be the angle of motion in terms of accuracy around the joint. The joint center displacement, the error rates were measured in centimeters, while the joint angle were measured in degrees. The range of motions performed included going from a sitting position to a standing position, a timed get up and moving position, squats, marching in place, others such as raising your hand, bending over, shaking your head, twisting your back and spine, and multiple points on a skeletal structure were recorded simultaneously, and not just necessarily one point and one angle at the same time. There were 12 total motions performed, and the data itself was acquired in multiple points across those different motions. As for the data analysis methodology, there were at first a direct comparison of the different motion values. It was identified that a correlation coefficient would need to be applied between the two different systems. This was a sliding dot product calculation, and the baseline for that cross-correlation coefficient was the known quantities based on the Qualis system. As this was a gold standard, the authors themselves had more background data available for the Qualis system and can use that to establish a baseline in terms of calculations and standardization. Additionally, a root mean squared and error analysis was performed on data acquired through both systems. For reference, the RMSE is an always positive value that helps indicate how precise data can be from a baseline. A value of 0 indicates that the two different statistical sets have a perfect fit. This isn't something that you'd ever really see in real life, let alone a laboratory setting, as it indicates that the two sets themselves have a perfect fit, and it is virtually impossible to have two items, even if they are the same product, have a perfect fit due to uncertainty that can come from manufacturing, application, human error, as well as a bunch of different other factors. However, the lower your RMSE value, the better an indication of fit between the two sets of data there is. Most interestingly, however, the authors developed their own performance metric, which they coined a term for called the summary metric. This was something that was a quotient between the RMSE and the CCR, as in they would take the RMSE, divide it by the CCR value, and then multiply it by an arbitrary standardization coefficient in order to remove any orders of magnitude between the two different data, and they could essentially preview the data itself on the same graph. The summary metric is something that indicates how good the data is. For example, if you have a high RMSE value and you're dividing it by any arbitrary amount of the CCR, you're going to have a high summary metric, which means that your error rate was very, very high, with the correlating value between the two different data sets being relatively arbitrary and unneeded, indicating a bad fit. If you have a low RMSE and a low CCR, you could still have a bad fit of the data because the CCR could indicate a value that puts you outside of their identified regions of essentially effective data. Though that does not necessarily mean a high CCR is bad or a high RMSE value is bad. The most important value is the quotient between the two. And in terms of multiple tests that were performed and data acquired, the authors found that the best range for their summary metric happened to be between the values of 0 and 2, while anything beyond 2 to the range of 4 generally indicated values that were pushing the limits of what the Kinect was able to record, and anything past 4 was essentially erroneous data that had no real statistical significance or use. So the ultimate goal was to try to find the areas in motion that the Kinect could score below a 2 on their summary metric. Here is an example of data that was acquired between the two different systems. The blue line is all of the call assist data found for antero-posterior movement, vertical movement, and mediolateral movement around your head, as in your neck joint. This motion, essentially, these 3 different ranges of motion, while the spine had the same ranges of motion with twisting and bending and rocking. These are all things that, if you notice, the data is relatively similar between the 2 different acquisition methods. But the Qualis system has a larger range, indicating a more accurate measurement, specifically with the vertical movement and the antero-posterior movement of the head. But for larger joint locations, such as with movement around the spine, the Kinect had a pretty similar range comparatively to the Qualis system. Also, if you also notice, they did calculate the coefficient and the RMSE values for each individual range of motion, and it was from that the data was then averaged across all of the motion. This was beneficial as it lets the researchers bear down onto that one significant summary metric for each of the 2 major categories of motion. For joint center displacement, the authors found that a CCR of 0.78 RMSE averaged to about 3.35 centimeters with a summary metric of 1.21. This indicates that the Kinect is actually pretty good at measuring the distances and anticipating the distances in movement, or I guess interpreting the distances in movement for joints across a lateral plane. It is good at doing distance movements. However, for joint angles, the summary metric was found to be 3.76, which is basically at the limit of what the Kinect was able to measure, indicating that for more for rotational movement, the Kinect was not as effective. I'm sure this is something that those who have used the system in video games have probably identified through their own trial and error, but it is nice to have hard data. This does give some hope to the author's intent of investigating this for a more cost-effective alternative to the Qualis system. The preliminary data and the analysis indicates that the Kinect is adequate for general biomechanical data acquisition purposes. Walking, standing, bending, simple movements that can be readily replicated with reasonable accuracy across repetitions. However, going into more specific motions that denote or require a more finesse, that require more finesse in their ranges of motion, the Kinect itself was outclassed by the Qualis system. This does, however, show, in my opinion, a interesting way for performance metrics to be summarized. The ability to develop not only your own performance metrics, but then use that to quantifiably compare 2 different products is an interesting point that I thought was something that did bear investigation, and it highlights that while a product can be developed for one intent, that does not necessarily mean it is something that it can always be used for or only should be used for. Um, it would probably behoove Microsoft to investigate the biomedical applications of the Kinect sensor, and I believe that is something that they have been investigating. As if you are able to expand the usage of the product, that just expands your customer base and expands your likelihood of increasing revenue. Um, so that I thank you all for listening to my presentation, and have a good day.